Reptiles are such a crazy and highly varied group of animals. It's insane. Like, they vary so much in where they come from, what they look like, adaptations, behavior, and size. And that's what I want to talk about today is 5 different reptiles that are the largest of their group and the smallest of their group. So let's get right into it. We're starting off with a really easy one, the reticulated python. So the reticulated python, is probably everyone who's probably watching this video knows, is the longest python in the world. They originally come from Southeast Asia, both on the mainland and in quite a few different islands surrounding it. Now, that being said, they're very highly varied in both look and in size. The island localities have a tendency to be much smaller, but the mainland ones seem to average 14 to 21 feet, which is a huge snake. Now, Python reticulatus, which is the Latin name for these guys, are the longest on record. There are quite a few other snakes that do compete for that title, but the longest verified official recorded length of one was 25 feet long, which was held by a reticulated python in a zoo here in the United States. However, there is a very highly corroborated one found in Asia that was reportedly at almost 33 feet in length. Now, there's a weird thing that happens with these very large constrictors and their lengths, that all of it gets kind of changed around because of like the time that they were found in. Sometimes they're, back in the 1800s, the early 1900s. They are sometimes where they're in the wild and out in the rainforest where you can't very accurately measure it. Sometimes they measure just a shed or just a skin, or even after the animal's deceased. There's a whole lot of variables that go into that makes it very difficult to get an actual accurate reading. So that's why for some of these larger ones, I always like to do the official one and then like the highly corroborated. So that is the reticulated python. Now let's talk about the smallest species of python. Now this isn't the smallest species of snake in the world. That is a species of blind snake found, I believe, in the Caribbean. But the smallest species of python in the world is the anthill or the pygmy python. Now, the pygmy python / anthill python belongs to a genus of snakes mostly found in Australia, a little bit into like the New Guinea areas, but mostly found in Australia, that is called Antaresia. That is the genus. They're made up of 3 different species: the anthill python, the spotted python, and the children's python. For a while, there was another one called the Stimson's python, but that has now been reclassified as a subspecies of one of the others. Now, the anthill or the pygmy python is the smallest of all of them, making it the smallest python in the world. On average, they typically do not exceed lengths of over 2 feet in length. And there's kind of a weird thing about these guys, and that's actually, they have found that males tend to be a little bit larger than the females, which is kind of the inverse of what we normally think of most pythons and boids in general, where usually pythons and boas are much larger when it comes to females, and then the males are typically much smaller. Whereas in the inverse with many colubrids, the males are bigger than the females, but I digress. The anthill python gets its name from a pretty obvious reason if you think about it, and that's typically that these guys are found in anthills or termite mounds. And that's for several different reasons, including one that is shared by the common reptile mythos of ball pythons that are found under only termite hills. They're actually found in quite a few different places, but that's ball pythons. These guys are very often found in these places for a couple different reasons, as I said previously. The first one is their habitat. So inside, underneath a termite mound, underneath an anthill, the temperature and humidity stays very consistent regardless of what's going on outside, either very cold, very hot, rainy, or dry, whatever that may be. Inside, underground, specifically under those things, under the termite mounds, it's a very consistent temperature and humidity, which is great for a reptile, in this case, the anthill python. The next one is security. It's underground, and a lot of animals don't like going around messing with termites and ants, especially in Australia, because, there's like bullet ants and things like that don't want to be messed with, although I'm not 100% sure if they're found in bullet ant nests or not. I don't believe that's the case, but it is a possibility. And then the last one is prey. So generally, there are small animals and reptiles, which reptiles make a good majority of the anthill python's diet in the wild. It's usually very small lizards and geckos, where they will be attracted to the ants and the termites for food, and when they come along, the anthill python can grab that as a prey item. Next on the list is the tortoise, and so that means that everyone probably knows where I'm going with this, and that is the Galapagos tortoise. The Galapagos tortoise is the largest species of living tortoise on the planet. Now, there is another one that often overlaps with it, but that is the Aldabra tortoise. Also another island, for the most part, tortoise like the Galapagos, only it seems that the Galapagos tortoise, even though there are a number of species both on the Galapagos archipelago and on mainland South America that vary both in size and in shell and carapace length and shape, the Galapagos tortoises seem to average heavier than the Aldabras, thus the belt goes to the Galapagos. Now, the largest Galapagos tortoise on record, verifiably, was over 800 pounds and over 6 feet in carapace length, which means that in length, just the shell of the tortoise, not counting the very long neck and head that they have, was actually longer than I am tall. Not by a great margin. I don't want to sit here and call myself short or anything like that, but a little over me. I believe it was actually 6 foot 1 inches long. The Galapagos tortoises have this kind of weird antithetical evolutionary process than when we normally think of when we think of island species. So generally what happens when you have a population of animals that is isolated to an island because of the prey, because of the area, because of a lot of different varying conditions, what generally happens to a lot of species that become isolated on islands, they are subject to a thing called dwarfism, to where they usually don't attain the size that they would for their other counterparts, usually on mainland from whatever populations they may be. The Galapagos and Aldabra tortoises, especially on the Galapagos Islands and on, the Aldabra, they have gigantism, where in fact they are much larger than their mainland counterparts, specifically when we're talking about the Galapagos tortoises. And as we know that, because of the theories of Darwin studying the finches and the Galapagos tortoises, that they're all a little bit different, but they are all very large. And they believe that because of their specific island gigantism, they actually are much better and adapted to those islands than a smaller tortoise would be, which is really, really crazy. These guys are really amazing animals. As far as I know, you can't actually own a Galapagos tortoise. You can't own an Aldabra tortoise. But even then, I'm not sure you would, because all of those animals can live well over 100 years. And in fact, the one of the very famous Galapagos tortoises lived for at least 175 years. I could not find a verified age of the longest lived one, but they are all averaging somewhere between 150 and 180 years, which is absolutely insane. We talked about the largest species of tortoise, now let's talk about the smallest one, which is one that I wasn't even 100% sure of. I thought it was the Egyptian tortoise or something similar. But it turns out what that actually is, that crown goes to the Cape speckled tortoise, or sometimes called the speckled padloper. Now, this is a tiny little species of tortoise found in the western part, for the most part, western part of South Africa. They live in very arid, rocky regions. And these, when I say they are tiny, they are so tiny. The males are a little bit smaller, and the males average about 3 inches in carapace length, with the females averaging about 4. So we're talking like this big. They're tiny, tiny, tiny. So cute. They're easily identified by basically because of their speckled, hence the name speckled, and then they have 5 toes on their front feet and then 4 on the back, which is a little bit different from some of the other tortoises in their genus. Now, these guys are absolutely adorable. They are threatened and endangered for several reasons. Obviously, the first one that you can probably think of is human encroachment, and a lot of them, like our native box turtles here in the United States and snapping turtles and other tortoise species, is because of traffic. They're always trying to cross the roads to get to other parts of their habitat or other environments, and then, unfortunately, cars. Another unfortunate factor is introduced species, not necessarily invasives, but a lot of like farm and dog animals, which are, yes, also invasive, but not usually. We kind of like categorize them in a slightly different little category. And the last one is poaching and hunting from humans. Now, even though it's been illegal to have these guys for a number of decades and be exported out of South Africa, they actually surprisingly do fairly well for that species of tortoise, that genus of tortoise, I should say. A lot of people look for a very small species of tortoise, which is why the Hermans and the Russian tortoises, despite being sometimes 2 to 3 times larger than these guys, are highly sought after. But because they are so much smaller and they actually adapt better, because as long as you're doing your due diligence and taking care of a tortoise properly, giving them the proper lighting, the space, and the varied diets, they actually do much better than other wild-caught tortoise species, which is cool, but it also kind of stinks. It's that annoying little double-edged sword that sometimes happen. Either way, such a cool little tortoise species. One of these days, I hope to be able to see one, maybe in a zoological facility or somewhere like that in real life. Just such a cute, tiny little tortoise. All right, we're going to do the last snake on this list, which I know is crazy. I normally dominate snakes with all of the different videos that I do. But we talked about the longest species of snake in the world, the reticulated python, and then its antithesis, the anthill pygmy python. Now let's talk about the largest and the smallest boas in the world. So obviously this one, we know where it's building up to, the green anaconda. Out of the 3 species of anaconda, the greens are the largest. They are found in the northern part of South America, east of the Andes. So the Andes mountain goes along the kind of western side of the top part, all the way down into Argentina of South America. They are found east of there in the Amazon basin and a little bit of the surrounding areas through Brazil, Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, those countries, and a couple others. And these guys are enormous. Anacondas are one of the very first species that you can think of when you think of sexual dimorphism, where males and females are very different, both in coloration and in size. In the case of the anaconda, females are significantly larger. Male green anacondas typically do not exceed lengths of about 10 or 11 feet. In fact, most average 7 to 9. In the case of my one male, because it's all I'm ever going to have as far as anacondas go, is one male, he's about 6.5-ish feet long. So he's getting pretty close to his adult size. And at the age he is, he's actually probably capable of siring offspring. Females, on the other hand, are significantly larger, both in length and in mass. These guys are those big, heavyweight snakes where sometimes they can exceed weights of over 500 pounds. Now, anacondas, just like reticulated pythons, are victims of kind of exacerbatory, stories where exaggeratory, that sounds better. I don't know what that word was, but exaggeratory stories to where we don't really know exactly how long they are. Now, I will say that for a long time and officially, the record length of an adult female green anaconda is just over 17 feet long. However, there have been several other stories that are fairly corroborated that seems to believe that one is about 27 feet in length. But again, there's the official and then the highly corroborated. There's a whole lot back and forth, and you can spend literally hours like I did on Google trying to figure out which one that is, going through Google Scholar and going through all these old papers even back into the 1960s. It's a whole thing. These guys are really cool. They have a bunch of adaptations that help them aid in where they live. So down in the southern hemisphere, it's kind of a rainy or dry season, winter and summer. There's not all 4 like we have in the northern hemisphere. And during the dry season, they are often found like in large grass plains. They're found crossing roads and traffic. And during the wet season, they are often found in torrential ponds and in large, full-time consistent water areas as well. They spend a good majority of their time, especially during the rainy season, submerged almost entirely underwater. When you look at their head, their eyes are actually at a little closer to the top of their head than you would normally think of when it comes to a boa species. And that's because just like a crocodile, they will have majority of their body underwater and they'll have just their nose and the top part of their head and eyes exposed so they can look for, in the case of smaller ones, predators, as well as boats, because where they live in the Amazon and the Rio Negro rivers, there's a lot of boat traffic and stuff, as well as looking for prey, because a baby anaconda is subject to be preyed upon by caimans, jaguars, piranhas, river otters, people, and then in the case of adult anaconda, they eat pretty much anything they want, from caiman to capybara to jaguars to all sorts of different stuff. Really amazing species, however, not really recommended, even less so than the reticulated python because of their husbandry requirements, having to be such a very large snake as well as such a large water Now supply. For the smallest species of boa in the world. This one was a little hard because it's really hard to get kind of large and official lengths of all of the different smaller species. Like, it's really easy to find a bunch of articles about how big they can get of the big ones. For the little ones, it's a little difficult. So if anyone can give me verified information that in fact they average smaller than the one I'm about to say, please let me know down in the comments, because I would love to be able to find out about that and learn more a little bit about those details. But as far as I can find, the smallest species of boa in the world is the Arabian sand boa. Now, the Arabian sand boa comes from a pretty obvious place in the Arabian Peninsula around Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Kuwait, and several other countries. These guys, as most sand boas, they look very similar to Kenyan sand boas, and they live in very similar areas where it's very sandy, dry, desert, rocky areas where they spend a majority of their time under the sand, just like the Kenyan sand boa, the Rusko sand boa, the Russian, all those guys. Now, these guys have become a little famous, although most people don't know what species of snake it is, because of TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, known as the derpiest snake in the world. And to be completely honest with you, it's kind of hard to argue that fact. I mean, look at this little thing, right? It has just that kind of like weird, flattened, broad, duck-billed looking face, where sometimes they almost like look a little bit upturned because its head is shaped as kind of a spade to allow for easier digging. Its eyes are at the very top of their heads, so just like the crocodile and the anacondas, they spend the majority of their time with their bodies mostly submerged, only under sand instead of water, with just their eyes and their noses exposed, so that way they can look for predators as well as prey. In the wild, these guys mostly eat a couple different species of gecko that run along the tops of the sand, not during the middle of the day. And then they'll just can snag those guys like a little graboid. If the little gecko's running around like Kevin Bacon, they just grab the little gecko. They aren't endangered by any means, but you don't really see them all in the pet trade. And the only reason that I could come to as to why that is that the countries that they come from, I imagine that a good majority of them probably come looking at their range, comes from Saudi Arabia. They don't export that species, so that means that they're not very common in the hobby. And in fact, as far as I'm aware, I've never actually seen one, even at some of the larger shows. So if anyone has also seen one or kept one, please let me know down in the comments, because I'd love to know how you keep them, because that'd be really, really cool. Really cool species of snake. I didn't even actually say how long they are. Unfortunately, here I go rambling again. They typically do not exceed lengths of 18 inches, so that is less than a foot long. In fact, usually the males being a little bit smaller don't exceed 14 or 15 inches. Ever, 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 ever. So very tiny little boa, especially when we consider even that's smaller than some of the Kenyan sand boas and the Saharan sand boas that we're more used to seeing, as well as obviously compared to something like a Cuban boa or a green anaconda. All right, we can't talk about some of the largest species of reptiles on the earth without mentioning this one, the true dragons. So obviously we're talking about the Komodo dragon, Varanus komodoensis. Now these guys come from obviously the Komodo archipelago, as well as several other islands around Indonesia. These guys are absolutely massive. Now, the title for the actual longest varanid lizard, or lizard in general, goes to the crocodile monitor. Also found in similar areas, mostly around like the Philippines and other places like that. But the heaviest and the largest goes to the Komodo dragon. Males being typically larger, the largest male dragon was just over 10 feet long and weighed over 300 pounds. So we're talking a big, big lizard. Now, I actually know a couple zookeepers that actually personally work with Komodo dragons, mostly the younger ones, but they do work with Komodo dragons, and these guys are cool. They're just as intelligent and personable and crazy cool as like the Asian water monitors, if not more so. Now, these guys are in fact known man-eaters, to where and that is because Komodo dragons, they're apex predators where they live. They can actually even travel back and forth between islands, which means they can cross salt water. And where they live, they eat everything from small birds, reptiles, monkeys, all the way up to water buffalo and people. They'll even go and eat carrion as well, which means they have been known to dig up graves of people. They've gone into graveyards. Sorry, there's flies. When it gets really hot out here, I end up leaving the door open sometimes, and it will crack itself open and flies come in. So apologies about that if you see me doing this, or flies crossing back and forth. But these guys have been known to get into graveyards and dig up bodies. So not really something you want to mess around a whole lot with. And the Komodo dragon actually is the species that led scientists to actually find that other than Heloderma, so the Gila monsters and the Mexican beetle lizards, they are actually venomous. For a long time, they thought that their bite was just highly septic of all like the crazy, gross bacteria in their mouths. And not to say that they are in fact not they don't have clean mouths, but they absolutely do have primitive and rudimentary venom glands. And they've actually used that to determine that several other species of monitors and other lizards are in fact venomous. That's a whole other conversation for a different video that we can talk about later down the road. Really, really cool species of lizard. And there's actually a pretty good booming tourism business of going to the Komodo Islands to actually be able to see these dragons in person. I think that'd be really cool. We all probably know a couple very specific other people in the reptile hobby who have gotten to be able to do so. I don't think that'll ever be something that I'll be able to do, especially just doing this. But hey, that'd be really cool down the road. However, after looking into it just like this much, I will say there's quite a few waivers you do have to sign to be able to do something like that for pretty obvious. Now, the smallest lizard in the world is not only one of the smallest reptiles and obviously lizards, but one of the smallest vertebrates in the world, possibly. Now, I actually talked a little bit about this species where I talked about 5 newly discovered reptiles. You can try to remember, put the link right here, and that is the micro chameleon. Now, this was discovered in Madagascar, like many chameleon species, a little while ago. Officially came to terms that it was a species in 2021. And we don't know too much about this lizard other than the fact that it is super tiny and a couple just kind of physical adaptations about it. So they are absolutely tiny. The males, in fact, as I said before, might be the smallest vertebrate in the world, with the male coming in at just 13.5 millimeters. That means fitting on the head of a pencil. Minuscule. The female not being that much bigger at about 19 millimeters. And it's just absolutely insane how small that is when compared to even some of the other small chameleons out there. Like, just tiny little things. Like, that's insane that is. And they know that for sure that they are adults based on another physical adaptation they have, and that is on the male. They, in fact, had very large and pronounced members. Don't yell at me, YouTube. But that is how they, in fact, they knew that it was a mature adult male, was because of that, as well as, the organs of the female as well. And it is very large. Don't exactly know why. And then the other adaptation that we know about it is that they can't actually change color. Now, we know that chameleons can't change color to match their backgrounds from red to orange to yellow to rainbow. We know they can't do that, but they do change hormonally, and they do change with their mood because of, attracting a mate or through dominance or defensive behavior, things like that. But not all chameleons can do that. Many can, and they're famous for it, certainly, but not all of them can do it. Most can. For sure, though, the micro chameleons cannot. And after that, it's really all about we know. We don't know for sure their life cycle, their lifespan, everything they eat, or even their range, but we are pretty sure that they're eating very small, tiny little isopods or even smaller little things like that under the leaf litter where they're found, because they are terrestrial chameleons, as well as their range is, just like many of the animals, specifically reptiles on the island of Madagascar, is very limited, and they were most likely endangered as well. Really cool species of chameleon, and I absolutely look forward to learning more about that as we discover things about. Now it's time we talk about the largest reptile on the planet. So this is the largest living reptile that we have on the planet of Earth as of right now. And that belongs to, if you haven't guessed it, the saltwater crocodile, also sometimes called the salty or the estuarine crocodile. Now these guys have a pretty wide-ranging range from essentially the coastal areas of eastern India, and essentially you can just sit there and follow it all the way along the coast of Asia, all the way down into Polynesia, the Philippines, and the islands around there, all the way up until the top northern coast of Australia, and all into like the estuaries and river systems a little bit inward from those coastlines. So these guys are called the saltwater crocodile, the estuarine crocodile, obviously because they can tolerate salt water, unlike many other reptiles and obviously crocodilian species, to where they are often found sometimes in open water, coming in conflict with things like sharks. Absolutely tremendous animals. They do vary a little bit in coloration and in size. Some of the larger ones do seem to be in Australia's Northern Territory, as well as like the Philippines. All crocodilians have these kind of big osteoderms, those big bumps on the back of their backs and on their necks. Those are actually, so they're bony plates, and when I say bony plates, that's what I mean. There are individual bones underneath their scale that act as kind of body armor. The saltwater crocodile is a little special, where they actually lack these two very large ones right on the back of their heads, and that's possibly because of just how bloody big they get. Now, when I say these guys are big, I mean they are big. They average 12 to 15 feet in length. Huge animals, with males being significantly larger than females. Now, there is, just like with the large constrictors, a great deal of controversy about the largest ones that have ever been found. Right now, the largest one that is for sure is held in captivity, and arguably the largest one ever caught, period, was a saltwater crocodile caught in the Philippines that they named Lalong. Now, Lalong unfortunately died very shortly after being captured and held in captivity, but he actually hit the length of 20 feet 3 inches. That is insane. That's longer than most reticulated pythons. absolutely huge. And in fact, the only one that one of the very few that I've ever seen in captivity is Maniac at Reptile Gardens, being the largest of the ones that I've seen out of like 3 other facilities. Another one is, I think it's the Indiana Zoo. But absolutely enormous animals. These guys are huge. Apex predators. They're hyper carnivores, which means that even though there are a lot of other carnivore species out there, including like big cats and dogs, they will sometimes eat other organic material that isn't exactly meat. That's all these guys eat. That's what hyper carnivores. So hyper carnivorous, very large apex predators, and a great deal of care needs to be kept when in areas where they're found. And in fact, they, just like the Komodo dragon, are known man-eaters to the point where they active because they are so intelligent. They're very smart, where they will specifically hunt people and in areas where people frequent because of where they come in going into the water. In fact, a great deal of crocodile attacks are unreported, especially in areas like India and in the Philippines and places like that. Now, when I said that the long is arguably the longest one ever found, there is another one that was found of a skull of a extant, which means currently living saltwater crocodile. So it wasn't an extinct species of crocodilian, it was just, deceased. And they have a head of it. And using skull to body ratio in terms of length, they estimated that that male saltwater crocodile was over 23 feet long. So an extra 3 feet, if not more, on top of the long and the largest saltwater crocodiles in the world. Now, the little final fun fact, although it's not exactly a fun fact, as to why that a great deal of caution needs to be taken, which is absolutely insane to me, like all the little boat river cruises that they do in, like, especially in the Northern Territory of Australia, where they have, like, the saltwater crocodiles, where they will leave the water and grab things off of large baited hooks, where the possibly, because this is argued and a little bit, contested, the largest animal attack ever recorded may have been a result of saltwater crocodiles. Back in World War II, there was a battle that was taking place on a small island off the coast of Burma, now called Myanmar, where British troops forced Japanese troops into retreat, where it was either be captured or retreat into mangrove swamps. And that's where over 1,000 Japanese soldiers retreated into the mangrove swamps. And overnight, this is what was told by just the handful of survivors, where the only things that could be heard were men screaming and gunshots. Possibly hundreds of Japanese soldiers were potentially killed by a large number of saltwater crocodiles overnight during that particular retreat of the Japanese soldiers during World War II. Now, it is contested by biologists and some naturalists based on purely the fact that the density of the jungles and the mangrove swamps where they live couldn't possibly hold that many crocodilian species. However, I have seen in some areas where the dense population of them, you can't really tell how many are there, even in very shallow water or in very small bodies of water. So, who knows? Either way, absolutely an amazing species reptile, but not exactly one that I would go out and play with like I do with alligators. So the very last one that we're going to talk about, so that was the largest crocodilian species. Now we're going to talk about the smallest crocodilian species. Now, this is not a species of crocodile, but it is a crocodilian. It's actually a caiman, which is kind of like a South American cousin of the alligators. And when we kind of break it down, it's kind of like gharial, crocodilians, alligators, and then in the alligators, it's like here's caiman and alligators. This is the Cuvier's caiman. And I've heard a couple different people pronounce it a couple different ways. That's how I've always heard it, and that's how I pronounce it, so please don't yell at me in the comments like I usually get. So the Cuvier's caiman. These guys average about 4.5 feet long, although they have been recorded at lengths of just over 5.5 feet, but they average the smallest, thus making it the smallest species of crocodilian. These guys are found down in South America in areas very similar to that of the anaconda, so east of the Andes, in the Amazon basin, and surrounding areas, and rivers and tributaries and large lakes and things like that, where this caiman is found. Now, these guys are often found in the wild in either pairs or entirely alone. There are times when crocodilians will come together and gather, especially during times where, the Great Migration of, the Nile crocodiles in Africa, and, times when fish are spawning and things like that, where crocodilians, and caiman specifically, because there are quite a few different species of caiman, will congregate during times of feeding or even during breeding. The Cuvier caiman seem to be pretty solitary as far as that goes. Now, these guys average the smallest. They're not the most common one in the pet trade. That actually belongs to their larger cousins, the smooth-fronted caiman, which are essentially like the next step up in size on average. Sorry, flies again. Where they just are a little bit more common in the hobby. Now, these guys have quite a few different interesting adaptations, even compared to that of the smooth-fronted caiman. So obviously their head shape is a little bit different. Sometimes they're called the wedge-headed caiman because their head looks like a little wedge, almost like a broad wedge head of an axe. And that might have to do something with their hunting adaptations, to where not only the Cuvier's caiman does this, but it's definitely been observed often with these guys. And that is where, so in South America, in the Amazon, caiman will eat quite a wide variety, and other things eat quite a wide, like the Orinoco crocodile. They basically eat kind of whatever they can find. They're very opportunistic predators. And the Cuvier's caiman has a pretty wide diet of invertebrates, of soft-shell crabs, of fish, of small reptiles, of birds, things like that, to where they have this interesting hunting adaptation where they will come along and they will actually like leave the water and go down on top of that. And maybe that wedge head helps with the resistance of going into the water to aid in the speed of coming down on their prey. A lot of other animals actually do something very similar, to where, like, if you've ever seen other nature documentaries, you've probably seen like a fox or a coyote, they'll like listen to like the snow on the ground or something, and they'll jump up and they'll land on top of like the mouse or vole or something like that. Really interesting species of caiman. They also have this other weird thing to where they seem to be the only species of crocodilian that don't do their very iconic death roll. So out of the 20-something species of crocodilians, even the gharial, the Indian gharial, those long, slender-snouted fish eaters from India, they will in fact death roll. That was recently observed. But the Cuvier's caiman seem to be the only species that don't do it for some reason. It's just kind of odd. It's just an odd little guy. They also have very large osteoderms. Again, apologies for the flies. To where, so remember we talked about the osteoderms from the saltwater crocodile crocodilians. The Cuvier's caiman have very large, pronounced ones. And I think that and as well as several other biologists, seems to have kind of come to this consensus, and that's essentially because of where they live and their size. So in the Amazon, everything eats little caiman. Jaguars, piranhas, giant river otters, anacondas, bigger caiman. And so I think that they have extra large osteoderms and extra plating on their underbelly, unlike alligators and a lot of crocodiles. Their underbelly is very soft. In fact, that's what you often see in the skin trade of them, is a lot of times it's their bellies and their underskills. Caiman don't have that. They have extra bony armor plating on their bellies and on their large osteoderms on the back, especially the Cuvier's caiman. And that's probably because everything eats little caiman. So probably that extra body armor, and not always, but it does seem to be a bit of a general consensus that a more cantankerous attitude is to probably adaptations that they have living where they do, as opposed to like an alligator, to where naturally once an alligator hits a certain size, not a whole lot can really mess with them other than people. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. It's always really fun to do these kind of top 5 videos where I get to learn and research a little bit more about that. That also opens myself up to a little bit more criticism in case I missed something or I just didn't quite do enough research, or even the correct research. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. As we talked about before, if you guys have any information specifically about some of the species that I didn't quite know too much about, please let me know down in the comments. If you'd like to see other videos, also please let me know down below. I do write it down, and if I think I can do those videos, I absolutely do them. For the species spotlight videos, I do try to have actual video or the animal in front of me, so that way you guys can actually see them for a little bit more in-depth conversation than these top 5 videos. But again, if you'd like to see anything else like that, you can put it down in the comments. You can email me any of that fun stuff that I also have linked down at the bottom of this video, and all of the other ones. Hopefully you enjoyed this video again. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it, and we'll check you next time.